Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. Have you ever wondered if it's logically possible for you to be an alligator?
Like a literal alligator.
Yeah, exactly. Not a metaphorical one. A literal swamp-dwelling, cold-blooded reptile.
Right.
Is that logically possible? Or, shifting gears entirely, imagine an omnipotent God holding the blueprints to reality.
Okay, big shift.
Yeah. Could that God genuinely create a world containing free creatures but absolutely zero evil?
Wow. I mean, those sound like late night thought experiment.
Oh, totally. The
Yeah.
kind of things you argue about in a dorm room and then just completely forget by morning.
Right. But they're actually the entry points into one of the most, rigorous intellectual landscapes ever constructed.
Which is exactly why we're here. Because usually when we talk about what is possible or what is necessary, we expect the precision of engineering.
Right, like physical laws.
Yeah. You drop an apple, gravity pulls it down, and a physicist points and says, there it is.
Right.
Given the mass of the Earth, that apple necessarily falls.
It's a very binary, comforting view of the world.
It really is.
We desperately want reality to be neatly categorized into, well, what absolutely must happen and what absolutely cannot happen.
But the moment you step into the world of 20th century metaphysics, that comfort just vanishes.
Poof.
Gone.
Suddenly we have to ask if that apple could be floating. Or, I don't know, could the apple be a bicycle?
Or does it only exist in a parallel dimension where it has no properties at all?
Right. You realize very quickly that the very concepts of possibility and necessity are under a massive attack.
And that attack was fierce. For a large part of the modern era, philosophers wanted to completely destroy the idea that anything is objectively necessarily true about the universe itself.
Which is exactly why today we are taking a sledgehammer to reality as you know it. We're doing a deep dive into Alvin Plantinga's landmark 1974 book, The Nature of Necessity.
That's a huge book.
It's massive.
Yeah.
And this isn't just a review. We are going to meticulously unpack the entire architecture of this text, all the chapters, all the parts. Oh, we are getting into the weeds today.
We really are. We're going to see how Plantinga rescued the concept of necessity from the skeptics, how he built an airtight framework of infinite possible worlds.
Which is fascinating, by the way.
Oh, it's wild. And then how he weaponized that framework to solve the most profound paradoxes of human existence, free will, and the divine.
He essentially took the cold mathematical tools of modal logic and applied them to ancient, seemingly unsolvable mysteries. The result is, well, it's a metaphysical cathedral.
Okay, let's unpack this. But before we get into the blueprints of this cathedral, I need to make one thing crystal clear to you, our listener.
The ground rules.
Yes, the ground rules. Because Plantinga applies his logic to highly debated theological concepts, specifically the problem of evil and arguments for the existence of God, we have to set a baseline.
Right.
Our mission today is strictly to impartially report on and analyze Plantinga's philosophical machinery. We are not here to endorse a specific religious worldview or like a political ideology.
Not at all.
We're looking at the math. We just want to understand how his logical engine operates, completely objectively.
And honestly, that's the only way to read this text. You don't have to worship inside a cathedral to stand in awe of the engineering that keeps the stone arches from collapsing.
Exactly.
We are here for the engineering.
Then let's start with the foundation. If we are eventually going to map out an entire multiverse of possible worlds, we first have to agree on what it means for something to be necessary.
And this is where Plantinga immediately runs into a massive roadblock erected by mid-20th century philosophy.
Right.
Thinkers like W.V.O. Quine led a dominant tradition that basically viewed necessity as a linguistic illusion.
Okay, wait. What do you mean by a linguistic illusion? Like we just made up the rules.
Essentially, yes.
Right.
Quine and his contemporaries argued that when we say all bachelors are unmarried, we aren't revealing some deep, necessary truth about the fabric of reality itself.
We aren't.
No, we are just exposing a convention of the English language. We built our dictionary in a way that makes that sentence true.
Oh, I see.
They wanted to dispense with necessity entirely, or reduce it to just, psychological habits and arbitrary linguistic rules.
So they were arguing that things aren't necessarily true about the universe. We just decided to talk in a way that makes certain sentences inescapable.
Precisely. But Plantinga rejects this completely.
Yeah.
He insists that necessity is real, it's objective, and it's totally independent of human language.
Okay.
But to defend it, he has to carefully fence off what he calls broadly logical necessity from a bunch of other concepts that people constantly confuse it with.
Let's draw those fences then. Because if I say It is necessary that a human breathes oxygen to survive. That feels very different from saying, it is necessary that 2 plus 2 equals 4.
Right, right.
That
This
is,
is the first and most vital distinction. Causal necessity versus broadly logical necessity.
break that down for me.
Okay, so it is causally impossible for an 18th century intellectual like Voltaire, for example, to swim the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, that's not happening.
Human biology and the laws of fluid dynamics dictate that he would just drown. Or, it's causally impossible for you to leap over a skyscraper.
Right, I am constrained by the physical laws of this specific universe. I'm causally bound.
But, and this is crucial, those physical limitations are not logically impossible.
Wait, really?
Yeah, in a strictly logical sense, there is no inherent contradiction in the concept of a human being swimming across an ocean.
Mm,
You can conceive of it without breaking the fundamental laws of logic.
I see.
Broadly, logical necessity, on the other hand, deals with truths that could not conceivably be false under any circumstances in any universe, regardless of the laws of physics.
Give me a pure example of broadly logical necessity, just so I can lock it in.
Sure, 7 plus 5 equals 12. Or no prime minister is a prime number.
Huh, okay, stop on the prime minister one. That perfectly illustrates it.
Right.
Because it doesn't matter if we are in a universe where gravity pushes things up instead of down, or, I don't know, a universe where humans breathe ammonia. The category of human politician and the mathematical category of integer divisible only by 1 and itself can never, ever intersect. The contradiction is absolute.
Yes, that is broadly logical necessity. But Plantinga has to build more fences because philosophers also constantly confuse necessity with epistemological concepts.
Epistemological, meaning like how we know things.
Exactly. For instance, Quine argued against necessity by pointing to this idea of unrevisability.
Unrevisability, meaning like a rule you are never allowed to change.
Right. Quine argued that any statement, even the most fundamental laws of logic, like the law of non-contradiction, could theoretically be revised if we really needed to save a complex scientific theory.
Really? Like what?
Well, Quine famously pointed out that some physicists have actually proposed revising basic logical laws just to make the mathematics of quantum mechanics easier to digest.
Wait, what? Giving up fundamental logic just to make physics math work? That seems incredibly dangerous.
It is. It's wild. But Quine's point was, well, if human beings are willing to revise a law of logic under pressure, then that law isn't a necessary truth.
Oh, I see his angle.
Yeah, he says it's just a deeply held theory we haven't thrown out yet.
No, let me push back on Quine then, because that sounds like he's conflating human behavior with objective reality.
How so?
Well, if I decide to revise the law of gravity by stepping off a roof, my quote-unquote revision doesn't change the absolute truth that I'm going to hit the pavement.
You've just hit upon Plantinga's exact counterargument.
Really?
Yes. Plantinga says necessity is not a popularity contest. It does not depend on what human beings are willing to revise or discard.
Right.
Even if we concede that humans might foolishly revise a logical law to save a physics equation, that doesn't mean the law wasn't a necessary truth to begin with.
So basically, just because we are confused doesn't mean reality is confused.
Exactly. Plantinga uses a brilliant example regarding math errors in Chapter 1.
Yeah.
Imagine you were adding up some large numbers, 97, 342, and 781. You add them up 4 times in a row, and every single time you make a mistake carrying the 1, and you conclude the answer is 1120 instead of 1220.
Okay, I've definitely done that.
Right. We all have. Now, based on your repeated checks, your belief that the answer is 1120 is totally rational to you. You are confident in it,
Sure.
but it is still false. And the true answer, 1220, remains a necessary truth, regardless of the fact that it wasn't obvious to you.
Ah.
Which brings up the next fence Plantinga builds. Necessity is not the same as self-evidence.
Because something can be an absolute unbending truth of the universe, but I might need to do like an hour of algebra on a chalkboard to actually realize it.
Yes. 7 plus 5 equals 12
Yeah.
is both necessary and self-evident.
Easy.
But a massively complex algebraic theorem might be necessary, yet completely opaque until you work it out.
Okay, so we've fenced off causal necessity, we fenced off unrevisability, and we fenced off self-evidence. Is there anything else cluttering up the concept of broadly logical necessity?
There's one more thing. A priori knowledge.
Meaning knowledge we have prior to or independent of physical experience. Like knowing a triangle has 3 sides without having to go outside and actually touch a triangle.
Right. It's often assumed that all necessary truths are known a priori, and all a priori knowledge is of necessary truths.
That sounds reasonable.
It does, but Plantinga breaks that assumption.
Yeah.
He argues you can actually have a priori knowledge of a contingent truth.
A contingent truth being something that happens to be true but didn't have to be true.
Exactly.
How can I know something like that without experiencing it?
Consider the proposition. I believe that 7 plus 5 equals 12. The fact that you believe it is a contingent fact.
Wait, my belief is contingent?
Yeah. You might not have existed. You might have been born in a society completely without math. So your belief is a contingent fact about the world.
Okay, I track that.
But how do you know you believe it? You don't have to conduct an empirical study on yourself. You don't have to survey your brain with a scanner.
No, I just know it.
Right. You know it independent of external experience.
Yeah.
You know a contingent truth a priori.
Wow. So my internal awareness of my own subjective state is a priori, even though my subjective state could have been completely different. That is incredibly precise.
It is. And by clearing away all this epistemological underbrush, Plantinga basically isolates pure, broadly logical necessity.
The core concept.
Yes, but having defined it, he immediately introduces a historical distinction that becomes the absolute engine for the rest of his philosophy.
Okay, what is it?
The split between didicto and de re.
Ah, right. Modality didicto versus modality de re.
If you don't grasp this, the rest of the multiverse architecture will just collapse. We have to get this right.
Let's ground this for our listeners then, because didicto translates literally from Latin to about the dictum or about the statement.
Right. When you apply necessity to dicto, you are saying that a specific proposition as a whole is necessarily true.
Give me an example.
For example, necessarily the number 9 is composite. The necessity is a property of the entire sentence.
That makes perfect sense. I am holding up a sentence, pointing at it, and saying, this string of words represents a necessary truth.
But modality de re translates to about the res, or about the thing.
The object itself.
Yes. This is when you ascribe a necessary property directly to an object itself, completely independently of how you describe it in a sentence.
Okay.
For example, the number 9 has the property of being essentially composite.
So didicto is like looking at a written statement that says water is wet and saying that statement is always true.
Yes.
But de re is pointing my finger at an actual glass of water on a table and saying this specific physical thing possesses an essential property of wetness. If you somehow removed the wetness, the object would instantly cease to be water.
That is a perfect physical analogy for a logical concept. In the de re case, the necessity isn't living in the grammar, it's living in the object. You are claiming that objects possess essential properties in and of themselves.
I understand the grammatical difference, but why does this matter? I mean, why is Plantinga making us split these hairs? It feels like we're just arguing over syntax.
Oh, it matters because de re necessity has massive real-world consequences, especially when you start looking at ancient paradoxes.
Like what?
What's fascinating here is how ancient and medieval philosophers, like Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, relied heavily on de re necessity.
Okay, let's look at Aquinas.
He was trying to solve a brutal paradox. If God is omniscient and knows everything that will happen, how can human beings have free will?
Ah, the classic trap. Because if God knows I'm going to drink this coffee tomorrow at 8 a.m., then tomorrow at 8 a.m. I must drink the coffee. I have no choice. Therefore, I am just a meat robot playing out a pre-written script.
Exactly. So Aquinas looked at a specific statement to solve this.
Mm-hmm.
The statement is, whatever is seen to be sitting is necessarily sitting.
Okay.
Now, apply this to God. If God sees you sitting, are you necessarily sitting? Are you trapped in that chair?
Let me apply the didicto de re split here.
Go for it.
If I interpret that statement didicto, looking at the whole proposition it means, the proposition, if God sees you sitting, then you are sitting, is a necessarily true logical statement. You can't have God see something that isn't happening.
Correct. The statement itself is logically true. But what if you interpret it de re?
If I interpret it de re, it would mean that I, the human being, suddenly possess the essential metaphysical property of sitting.
Right.
Which is absurd, because my essence is to be a human, not a piece of furniture. Yeah. I have the physical ability to stand up.
Exactly. Aquinas argued that the statement is true didicto, but it is absolutely false de re.
Wow.
You, the object, do not possess the essential property of sitting. Therefore, your action remains contingent and your free will is preserved, even though the overarching logical proposition about God's vision remains intact.
That is incredibly slick. So by separating the truth of the sentence from the essence of the object, Aquinas sneaks human freedom right past absolute divine foreknowledge.
This is brilliant. But here's the problem. Mid-20th century philosophers hated de re modality.
They hated it. Why?
They thought this idea of essentialism, the idea that objects have core, immutable properties hiding inside them, was just mystical garbage.
Which brings us to a major conflict in the book, the essentialism controversies. Plantinga has to go to war with some of the greatest minds of his era who think deremodality is an illusion.
And he takes their objections head on in chapters 2 and 3. The first major skeptic he tackles is Gilbert Harman.
Okay, let's talk about Harman.
Harman wanted to prove that objects do not have essential properties by using mathematics.
Math. How does Harman use math to destroy essentialism?
Well, Harman focused on the number 9. Plantinga claims the number 9 is essentially composite, meaning it is essentially divisible by something other than 1 and itself.
Right.
Harman says, not so fast. In modern set theory, mathematicians often reduce numbers to sets. For instance, the number 0 can be defined as the empty set.
Okay.
The number 1 is a set containing the empty set, and so on.
Right. It's a way of defining numbers purely through logic and grouping.
So Harman argues, if the number 9 can be theoretically reduced to, or identified with, a specific set, well, the set itself is just a collection of abstract items. A set doesn't have the property of being composite or prime.
Oh, I see.
Therefore, if 9 is identical to a set, and the set isn't essentially composite, the 9 isn't essentially composite either.
He's using Leibniz's law.
Yes.
If X and Y are the exact same thing, they must share all the exact same properties. So if 9 is a set and sets aren't composite, 9 isn't composite.
That sounds weirdly airtight, actually.
Yeah.
How does Plantinga escape that?
By showing that Harman is fundamentally misunderstanding what mathematicians are doing when they reduce numbers.
What are they doing then?
Plantinga points out that this kind of theoretical reduction isn't a statement of literal metaphysical identity. It's a structural mapping.
A mapping.
Right. To prove how absurd Harman's logic is, Plantinga says you could just as easily create a mathematical progression where you map the numbers onto something entirely different.
Plantinga says you could identify the number 0 with President Richard Nixon.
I'm sorry, what? Richard Nixon?
Yes. You map 0 to Richard Nixon. You map the number 1 to the proposition that Richard Nixon is less than 1 foot tall.
Oh my God.
You map the number 2 to the proposition that Richard Nixon is less than 2 feet tall, and so on. Mathematically, this sequence functions perfectly well as a structural model for numbers.
Okay, I see where this is going. If I use Leibniz's law on that model, I would have to argue that because Richard Nixon is not essentially divisible by 3, the number 9 is not essentially divisible by 3.
Precisely. Which is completely absurd.
Yeah, that makes no sense.
The fact that numbers can be theoretically mapped onto sets or presidents does not mean the number 9 is literally that set, any more than it is Richard Nixon.
Right.
The number 9 retains its essential properties, regardless of what theoretical model you use to represent it. Harman's objection confuses a structural representation with metaphysical identity.
That is a devastating takedown. Okay, Harman is out. What about the next skeptic? William Neal. His objection sounds a lot trickier. It's about the 12 apostles.
Neal's objection is a masterpiece of linguistic misdirection.
Lay it out for me.
He says to the essentialist, you claim the number 12 is necessarily composite. You say it possesses this property, essentially.
Which we do. 12 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, and 6.
But Neal points out the number 12 is also the number of the apostles. Jesus had 12 apostles. Now, Neal asks a simple question. Could the number of apostles have been 11?
Yes, of course. Judas could have quit a week early, or Jesus might just have chosen 11 guys to begin with. The historical fact is contingent.
Exactly. So Neal springs his trap, he says. If the number of apostles could have been 11, and 11 is a prime number, then the number of apostles is not necessarily composite.
Oh.
It could have been prime. Therefore, whether a number is composite or prime depends entirely on how we describe it. If we use the phrase the number 12, it's composite. If we use the phrase the number of apostles, it's contingently composite. Neal concludes that essentialism is fake because properties depend on our language, not on the object itself.
Oh, that's sinister. I feel like my brain is tied in a knot. If the number of apostles is 12 and the number of apostles could have been 11, then 12 could have been 11. That can't be right.
It's not.
Let me try to untangle this using the tools we just built. Is Neal confusing de dicto and de re?
He absolutely is.
Yeah.
Look closely at the phrase, the number of apostles could have been 11.
Okay. If I read that statement de dicto, looking at the whole proposition, it means the proposition, there are exactly 11 apostles, is a logically possible proposition. And that is true. It is a possible historical reality.
But what happens if you read Neal's claim to de re? Remember, DRE points past the language directly to the actual object being discussed.
The actual object that numbers the apostles in our real world is the integer 12. So if I read it Dere, pointing at the integer 12, Neil is claiming, the integer 12 has the essential possibility of being the integer 11,
Right.
and that is pure nonsense. The number 12 can never be the number 11.
You've got it. The number 12 itself is always essentially composite. The fact that the apostles happen to be a group of 12 is an accidental contingent property of that specific historical group of men.
It has nothing to do with the number itself.
Exactly.
Right.
It is not a property of the number 12. Neil is playing a linguistic shell game, hiding a Dewey absurdity inside a didicto truth.
This is why it's so important to have these tools. If you don't know the difference between didicto and Dere, these skeptics will talk you into believing that reality isn't real.
They absolutely will.
Which brings us to the final boss of anti-essentialism in this book, Quine. Quine has a famous thought experiment called the mathematical cyclist.
Oh, this is a classic. Quine is trying to show that the very idea of an object having an essential property is completely arbitrary.
How does he do that?
He sets up a puzzle. Let's agree on two broad rules for the sake of the argument. Mathematicians are necessarily rational, and cyclists are necessarily bipedal, meaning they have two legs.
We'll ignore the fact that there are exceptions in real life. We'll just accept his premises for the logic puzzle. Mathematician equals rational, cyclist equals two legs. Got it.
Now, Quine introduces a specific individual. Let's call him Paul. Paul happens to be both a mathematician and an avid cyclist.
Okay, Paul rides bikes and does math.
Quine then asks the essentialist a seemingly impossible question. If we look at Paul the object, in and of himself, what is his essence? Is Paul necessarily rational but only contingently bipedal? Or is Paul necessarily bipedal but only contingently rational?
So Quine is saying that if you try to nail down Paul's essence, it slips through your fingers because it completely depends on how you were looking at him.
Yes.
If you look at him while he's doing calculus, his essence is rationality. If you look at him while he's wearing spandex on a bicycle, his essence is having two legs. Therefore, Quine argues objects don't have built-in essences. We just project our current interests onto them.
That is Quine's exact argument.
Hmm.
But Plantinga points out that Quine is making the exact same structural error as Neil. He is taking a didicto truth and forcing it into a Dewey mold.
Break that down for me.
The premise mathematicians are necessarily rational is a didicto truth about a category. It means, necessarily, anyone who belongs to the category of mathematician exhibits rationality.
Okay, that makes sense.
But Quine assumes that if you belong to that category, the property must somehow fuse to your Dewey essence.
Let me try to argue for Plantinga here. I would say to Quine, yes, the concept of a cyclist implies two legs, but Paul, the human being, is only contingently a cyclist.
Exactly.
Paul could get hit by a car, lose a leg, completely give up cycling, and he would still fundamentally be Paul. So being a cyclist and being bipedal are not essential properties of Paul.
Exactly. Quine assumes that because Paul is a cyclist, the essential traits of cycling become the essential traits of Paul. The essentialist completely rejects that leap.
Right, he's just Paul.
Yes. Paul has his own essence, perhaps being a human person that persists regardless of whether he ever rides a bike or solves a math problem. Quine's bewilderment is based on a totally fabricated straw man of essentialism.
But listen, if all these brilliant guys, Herman, Neil, Quine, are so thoroughly confused by Dewey modality, Plantinga must realize he has a communication problem.
Oh, he does.
He can't just keep playing defense. He needs to build a foolproof mathematical bridge so these skeptics stop complaining that essentialism is just mystical word magic.
And he does. This is one of the most technical but necessary parts of the book found in Chapter 3. Plantinga introduces what he calls the kernel function.
The kernel function.
Yes. The goal of the kernel function is to prove that Dewey modality isn't obscure by translating it perfectly into the didicto terms that the skeptics already accept.
Okay, we need to go slow here. How does a function translate metaphysics into grammar?
It works by mapping properties to proper names. Plantinga states that to say an object X has a property P, essentially, which is the controversial Dewey claim, is logically equivalent to saying two things. Okay, what are the two things? First, X actually has property P, and second, the specific proposition X lacks P is necessarily false.
Let me test this with an example. I want to make the Dewey claim. Socrates is essentially a person.
Okay.
To satisfy the kernel function, I translate it to a didicto proposition. First, Socrates is a person. Second, the proposition Socrates is not a person is a logically impossible statement.
Exactly. By using the proper name, Socrates, you lock the identity of the object into a de dicto proposition.
Yeah.
You've bridged the gap. You've described an essential property using only the accepted rules of logic.
But wait, let me push back on this because Quine raised another objection about quantified modal logic in the appendix that feels relevant here.
Okay, bring it on.
Plantinga's kernel function relies entirely on using the proper name of an object. Socrates, Paul, the number 9. What if the object we are talking about doesn't have a name?
Give me an example. What kind of object?
Let's say I'm on a boat in the Indian Ocean and I see a massive shark. It's the largest shark in the ocean. I don't know its name. Nobody has tagged it. Does this object suddenly lack essential properties just because humanity hasn't slapped a name tag on it?
That's a good point.
Because if the kernel function requires a name and the shark doesn't have one, the logic breaks down out in the wild.
That is a very sharp pushback, and it gets to the heart of how logic interfaces with reality. But Plantinga anticipates this. He says that the kernel function applies to what he calls baptized objects.
Baptized.
Yeah. If an object out in the wild doesn't have a name, we, as rational agents, can simply stipulate one. We logically baptize the largest shark in the Indian Ocean. Let's call it Bruce.
Bruce. Classic.
The moment we baptize it, we lock its identity into a designator, and we can run the kernel function. We can say Bruce has the property of being a fish, essentially, because the proposition Bruce is not a fish is necessarily false.
Okay, I see. The logic doesn't require a government-issued birth certificate. It just requires the cognitive act of isolating an object and holding it steady in our mind with a label.
Exactly.
Once we do that, we can interrogate its essential properties.
Correct. And with this, Plantinga has successfully defended his territory. He has cleared the brush. He has proved that objects genuinely possess essential properties in and of themselves, and he has built a function to translate that truth into strict logic.
Which means we are finally ready to leave the ground and launch into the architecture itself.
Yes. Chapter 4.
Because if an object holds an essential property, like the number 9 being composite, or Socrates being a person, or Bruce being a fish, we need a special framework to map what that actually means across all logical possibilities. We need the multiverse.
This is where Plantinga introduces the concept of possible worlds. Now, we have to be very careful here. When Plantinga talks about a possible world, he is not talking about a parallel dimension in a science fiction sense.
Right, this isn't a place you can travel to in a spaceship or through a portal.
No. A possible world is defined rigorously as a maximal possible state of affairs.
What does the word maximal mean in this context?
It means it is completely exhaustive. There are no blank spots. For every single possible state of affairs that could ever be conceived, a maximal world either explicitly includes it or explicitly precludes it by including a contradictory state of affairs.
Give me an example of a state of affairs, just so I can visualize it.
Take the historical fact. Jim Whittaker is the first American to climb Mount Everest. That is a state of affairs.
Okay.
A maximal world must take a stance on that. It either includes that exact state of affairs, making it true in that world, or it precludes it by including something contradictory, like Luther Gerstad is the first American to climb Mount Everest, or even Mount Everest never existed in this world.
Wow, okay.
A possible world is a complete, total, microscopic description of an entire reality from top to bottom. It is a fully rendered universe of logic.
So if there's a world where I am wearing a red shirt today instead of a blue shirt, that world also contains facts about the gravitational pull of distant galaxies and the outcome of the Peloponnesian War. It is totally complete.
Yes, and Plantinga pairs these worlds with a brilliant conceptual tool he calls books.
Books.
For every possible world, there is a maximal set of propositions that are true in that world. Plantinga calls this exhaustive library of statements the world's book.
So the world is the actual state of affairs, the physical or logical reality of it, and the book is the infinite encyclopedia that perfectly describes everything happening in that reality.
Precisely. We have an infinite number of possible worlds and an infinite number of corresponding books. But this raises a massive question.
What is it?
Since we are clearly sitting here having a conversation of one specific reality, how does Plantinga distinguish our world from the infinite others? He has to define actuality.
Right. Why is our world real, and the world where I am wearing a red shirt just an idea?
Plantinga makes a subtle but profound distinction here. He says that every world is actual in itself.
Wait, what does that mean? How can a hypothetical world be actual?
Think about the sentence, I am speaking. Whenever anyone says that sentence, it is true for them in that moment.
Hmm.
Or think about a map. If you put a pin on a map and label it, "You are here," that label is accurate relative to the pin.
Okay, so if I'm a hypothetical person standing inside World B, I would look around and say, World B is the actual world. And my statement would be true inside the context of World B.
Exactly. Actuality functions somewhat like a location pin. But Plantinga argues there is something more. Out of the infinite spread of possible worlds, only one world has the absolute objective property of being actualized.
And that's our world.
Yes, we call our world alpha. Alpha isn't just actual relative to us. It is the unique, singular world that has the absolute property of truly obtaining in reality. All the other worlds are merely possible. They exist as abstract concepts in alpha, but they do not obtain.
Alpha is the winner. It's the one world where the lights are actually turned on.
Yes. And this brings us to one of the most mind-bending concepts in the entire book, world-indexed properties. This is how Plantinga links objects in alpha to objects in the multiverse.
Okay, I am strapping in. Walk me through it.
Let's use Socrates again. In our actual world, alpha, Socrates has the historical property of being snub-nosed. He had a flat, pushed-in nose.
Right.
But this is an accidental property. In another possible world, say world B, Socrates might have been born with a perfectly straight Roman nose.
So far, so good. Nose shape is contingent.
But watch this maneuver. Socrates doesn't just have the property of being snub-nosed. He has the highly specific property of being snub-nosed in alpha.
Okay, you just added the world tag to the property.
Now let's theoretically travel to world B, where Socrates has a straight nose. While Socrates is walking around world B with a straight nose, does he still possess the property of being snub-nosed in alpha?
Let me think about that. If I'm standing in world B, yes. Because even if I am in a different universe, it remains an absolute, unchanging historical fact that back in world alpha, Socrates has a snub nose.
Yes.
The reality of alpha doesn't evaporate just because I'm looking at a different possibility.
Exactly. What happens in alpha is an unchangeable fact across the entire multiverse. Therefore, the property of being snub-nosed in alpha is an essential property of Socrates. He possesses that specific world index property in every single possible world he exists in.
Whoa, okay, let me make sure I grasp the gravity of this. You are telling me that every single trivial, accidental fact about me in this real world, what I ate for breakfast, the shirt I'm wearing, translates into a rigid, essential property of my identity across infinite alternate universes, simply because it is a fixed fact that I did it in alpha.
Yes. Your contingent actions in this world become essential anchors of your identity across the multiverse.
That is staggering, but let's apply it. How does this logical trick actually solve anything?
It allows us to solve massive historical arguments about the nature of reality. Take René Descartes. He famously struggled with the mind-body problem. He wanted to prove that a human being is fundamentally an immaterial soul, not just a physical machine.
I think, therefore I am.
Right. Descartes argued something like this. I can vividly conceive of myself existing without a physical body, perhaps as a floating consciousness. Because I can conceive of it, it must be logically possible. If it is possible for me to exist without my body, then my physical body is not an essential part of who I am. Therefore, I am essentially an immaterial thing.
It's a classic argument, but it feels a bit loose. How does Plantinga use the multiverse to tighten it?
Plantinga uses the possible worlds architecture to test the logic to its absolute breaking point. Plantinga asks a bizarre question. Could Socrates have been an alligator?
An alligator? Why an alligator?
Because an alligator is the purest example of a purely material object. It is flesh, bone, scales, and instinct. So let's run Descartes' logic through Plantinga's machine. Let's assume Descartes is right, and human persons like Socrates are essentially immaterial.
Okay. If Socrates is essentially immaterial, then by definition he is immaterial in every possible world he exists in.
Now look at the alligator. An alligator is essentially a material object. Therefore, an alligator is material in every possible world.
Oh, I see the collision coming.
If Socrates is immaterial in all worlds, and an alligator is material in all worlds, there is zero intersection. There is no possible world anywhere in the infinite spread of logic where Socrates is an alligator.
Because it's a contradiction.
Right. Because it is a strict logical contradiction to be both essentially immaterial and essentially material at the same time. The architecture definitively maps what an object can and cannot be.
It totally clarifies the boundaries of reality. But wait, let me push back on this architecture. You keep saying in every possible world, but I have a question about relative possibility.
Go ahead.
If I am standing in world B, Are the rules of what is possible different than if I am standing in world A? For example, imagine world C is a universe where magic exists and the laws of physics are totally broken.
Okay, magic world.
If I am in world C looking out at the multiverse, does the existence of magic in my world warp the grid? Does it change what is considered possible across the whole system?
That is a phenomenal question. You're asking about the accessibility relations between worlds, which is the core of what logicians call System S5 and modal logic.
System S5.
Yeah. System S4 says that if something is necessarily true, it's necessarily necessary. But S5 goes further. System S5 proves that relative possibility does not change based on your location in the multiverse.
Why not? If my world has magic, shouldn't my horizon of possibilities be wider?
No, because broadly logical necessity isn't anchored to the local laws of physics or magic in a specific world. It is anchored to the fundamental laws of logic itself.
Oh, I get it.
A square circle is a logical contradiction in world A, world B, and world C. The space of all possible worlds is fixed and absolute. If a state of affairs is logically possible in one world, it is necessarily possible across all worlds. The grid never warps.
Okay, so the multiverse is an absolute unmoving framework, which means we have to figure out how things move through it. Because if these worlds are maximal states of affairs and we have a fixed grid, how does a specific concrete individual like you or me exist in multiple different worlds?
This brings us to chapters 5 and 6. This is the infamous problem of transworld identity. But before we can solve how an object travels, we have to formally define what an essence is. We've talked about essential properties, but an essence is a much more powerful concept.
Right. An essential property is something you have to have, like being a person. But my essence feels like it should be exclusively mine.
That is exactly Plantinga's definition. An essence is a property that is essential to an object, and it is essentially unique to that object. No other object in any possible world can possess it.
Okay, so being a person is an essential property of Socrates, but it's not his essence because I am also a person. We share that property.
Correct. Socrates' essence is a highly complex property that only he has. Plantinga calls this unique property Socrateity. It is the irreducible property of being Socrates. And Plantinga argues that when we use proper names in logic like Socrates, we're actually verbally expressing these unique, unrepeatable essences.
So here's the transworld identity problem. I possess my unique essence. Let's call it hostness. I exist in World Alpha as a podcaster, but it's logically possible that I could have been a carpenter.
Sure.
So in World B, there is a carpenter. The question is the carpenter in World B actually me?
Yes. If he possesses your unique essence, he is strictly identical to you. But a lot of prominent philosophers violently disagreed with this idea. The most famous was David Lewis, who proposed something called counterpart theory.
Counterpart theory, how does that differ from transworld identity?
David Lewis argued for the theory of world-bound individuals. He believed that an object can only exist in one world. You, the host, are permanently glued to world alpha. You cannot exist anywhere else.
Okay, but if I'm stuck in Alpha, who is the carpenter in World B? I know it's a possible world, so someone is swinging a hammer over there.
According to Lewis, the carpenter in World B is not you. It is a counterpart of you. It is an individual who is extremely, remarkably similar to you in appearance, history, and personality. But strictly, metaphysically speaking, it is a completely different person.
Wait, I absolutely hate that. If I say I could have been a carpenter, Lewis is looking at me and saying, no, you couldn't have been. You are trapped as a podcaster. But don't worry, a guy in another universe who looks just like you gets to be a carpenter.
Yep, that's what he's saying.
That doesn't help me. That destroys my concept of free will.
Your outrage is exactly Plantinga's philosophical counterattack. Plantinga violently rejects counterpart theory because it destroys the metaphysical reality of modality and human freedom. If only your counterpart takes a different action in another world, then you never truly had the capacity to do otherwise.
Wow.
If you are world-bound, then every single property you have in this world becomes essentially bound to you because you don't exist anywhere else to experience an alternative.
It's just fatalism wearing a multiverse disguise. It renders the whole concept of alternative possibilities entirely useless.
It does. Furthermore, Plantinga dismantles the psychological error that causes people to fall for counterpart theory in the first place. He calls it the telescope metaphor.
How does the telescope mislead us?
Philosophers get confused because they imagine possible worlds as distant physical planets. They think they have to pick up a magical telescope, peer across the void into World B, look around at the millions of inhabitants, and try to find empirical traits to identify which one is Socrates.
Like trying to spot him in a crowd.
Right. And since the carpenter in World B doesn't have a microphone, and maybe he has a different haircut than the podcaster in World Alpha, the philosopher panics,
Yeah.
they say, he looks different. It must be a different guy.
But Plantinga says we aren't using a telescope.
Right. We don't identify Socrates by looking for him empirically. We stipulate him by logic. A possible world is just a maximal state of affairs. We simply say, consider the state of affairs where Socrates decided to become a carpenter.
Oh.
By logical definition, the person in that state of affairs, I as Socrates. You don't have to go searching for him with a telescope. You planted him there with your premise.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting for me. I'm imagining this like an actor playing different roles.
I like that.
David Lewis's counterpart theory is saying that for every different stage play, the director hires a completely different actor who just happens to look remarkably like you. But Plantinga is saying, no, it is strictly you on every single stage. You are just wearing a different costume. The costume represents your accidental properties. Carpenter, podcaster, red shirt, blue shirt. But beneath the costume, the core identity, the essence, is absolutely identical.
That is a brilliant analogy. The core identity, the actor, travels across the worlds. Why do philosophers struggle with transworld identity? Because they mistakenly think that saying Socrates exists in World B entails that Socrates must bring along all his actual properties from World Alpha. They think he has to bring his specific toga and his snub nose.
But he only brings his essential properties. He brings his personhood and his unique Socrateity, but he leaves the toga and the snub nose back in World Alpha.
Exactly. Transworld identity is flawlessly logical once you stop treating possible worlds like physical planets you have to travel to.
Okay, we know how real people travel across worlds, but this brings us to chapters 7 and 8, which tackle an incredibly weird paradox. What about things that don't exist here at all?
Yes. Non-existent objects.
Because if we have an infinite multiverse of possibilities, there must be objects in those other worlds that never became actual in our world. Do those non-existent objects exist?
This is one of the oldest, thorniest puzzles in philosophy.
Yeah.
The classical argument, famously championed by Alexis Meinong, goes like this. To say the round square does not exist or Mr. Pickwick doesn't exist, you must first grasp the object in your mind in order to ascribe the property of non-being to it.
Because you can't talk about a true absolute nothing. If I say, Mr. Pickwick is entirely fictional, I am directing my thoughts at something.
Right. Meinong argued that because you can think about them, possible, but unactual objects must have some form of being. They must subsist in some shadowy twilight realm of non-existence. They don't have physical reality, but they have metaphysical presence.
And didn't this idea get a modern upgrade with modal logic?
It did, through what we call Kripke semantics.
Yeah.
Saul Kripke developed incredible mathematical models for modal logic. It's called pure semantics. In these models, the domains of different possible worlds contain different sets of individuals. Mathematically, it works perfectly. But when you try to apply this mathematical model to actual reality, applied semantics, it seems to imply that there are domains in other worlds containing actual entities that simply do not exist in our world. And if they don't exist here, but they exist there, don't they have some sort of shadowy reality?
A ghost realm of unactualized things.
Yes.
What does Plantinga say about this? Does his cathedral have a basement for ghosts?
Absolutely not. Plantinga's refutation of Meinong and applied Kripke semantics is swift and brutal. He says there are no non-existent objects. It is an oxymoron. To say there is a thing that does not exist is a blatant logical contradiction. Furthermore, he establishes a strict, unbending rule. If an object does not exist in a world, it has no properties in that world.
Wait, none at all. So in a possible world where I was never born, I don't even have the property of being non-existent.
Correct. You simply aren't there to have properties. Properties are not floating in the ether. They must be anchored to existing things. If the thing isn't there, there are no properties.
But hold on, I have to push back here. If non-existent objects have no properties, and they don't exist in any shadowy realm, how do we solve the fashion problem? When Shakespeare writes Hamlet, who is he talking about? When Melville writes about Moby Dick, what is he describing? Are they acting like magical telescopes, naming real but unactualized entities in a parallel universe?
This is where Plantinga introduces his brilliant fiction solution. He says authors are not naming non-existent entities in World 42. Instead, they are doing a very specific logical maneuver. Plantinga distinguishes between two types of singular propositions, predicative and impredicative.
Okay, let's translate that into plain English.
A predicative proposition assigns a property to a specific existing thing. The host is sitting. You exist. You have the property of sitting.
Simple enough.
But an impredicative proposition asserts that a specific set of properties, or an essence, is uninstantiated. It means the blueprint is empty.
Ah, it describes a shape but admits there's nothing filling the shape.
Exactly. So when Shakespeare sits down to write a play, he is constructing a massively complex, impredicative proposition. Plantinga calls this a storyline. Shakespeare is not asserting that a real man named Hamlet exists in a shadow realm. He is exhibiting or presenting a complex concept, a storyline, without asserting it as true in our actual reality.
So when Shakespeare writes Hamlet, he isn't describing a guy in an alternate universe. He's just hanging a massively complex concept in the air for us to look at and emotionally react to.
Yes, he is exhibiting an uninstantiated essence.
Right.
And this is vital because it explains how we can judge statements about fiction to be true or false without needing a ghost realm. If a literary critic publishes a paper claiming Othello was an Eskimo, we immediately know that is false.
Right.
But it's not false because there is a real Othello in another dimension who is angry about being misidentified. It is false because the specific storyline exhibited by Shakespeare logically entails a Moor, not an Eskimo.
Yeah.
The truth value lives in the structure of the concept, not in a shadowy, non-existent object.
That cleans up so much metaphysical baggage. We don't need a ghost realm for Harry Potter, Captain Ahab, or Mr. Pickwick. They are just complex storylines hanging in the air, uninstantiated in our actual world.
Exactly. And with this, Plantinga has cleared the board. He has established the reality of necessity. He has built the multiverse of possible worlds. He has proven how transworld identity works. And he has eliminated the paradox of non-existent objects. The logical engine is fully assembled, fueled, and ready.
Which means he is ready to take this pristine logical architecture and drive it straight into the ultimate philosophical test. Chapter 9. The heavyweight title fight of theology and philosophy. We are talking about the problem of evil.
This is the crescendo of the book. For centuries, atheologians, philosophers constructing arguments against the existence of God have used the problem of evil as their absolute primary weapon. In the mid-20th century, J.L. Mackie formulated it in strict, unyielding logical terms.
Let's lay out Mackey's argument because it is devastatingly simple.
Mackie argued that the following two propositions are strictly logically inconsistent. Proposition 1. An omnipotent, holy, good God exists. Proposition 2. Evil exists. Mackie said you cannot logically have both in the same universe. It is a contradiction, like a square circle.
Because if God is omnipotent, he can stop evil. If he is wholly good, he wants to stop evil. Yet evil exists, therefore that specific formulation of God cannot logically exist.
Right. And a lot of Mackie's confidence in this logical trap relies on an assumption made centuries earlier by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Plantinga calls this Leibniz's lapse.
Okay, what was Leibniz's mistake?
Leibniz assumed that because God is omnipotent, God has the power to actualize any logically possible world. Since God is wholly good, he would obviously choose to actualize the best world. Therefore, Leibniz argued, this world with all its suffering and pain must mathematically be the best of all possible worlds because God chose it.
Which is an idea that Voltaire famously and viciously mocked in his book Candide. Because if you just look out the window at war, disease, and cruelty, this clearly does not feel like the best of all possible worlds.
Exactly. Mackie looked at Leibniz and said, I agree with your premise that an omnipotent God could create any possible world. But I look at reality, see it clearly isn't the best, and therefore conclude God doesn't exist. Plantinga steps into this debate and says that both Leibniz the theist and Mackie the atheist made the exact same fatal logical error.
What's the error? They both assumed God's omnipotence is a blank check.
Yes, they misunderstood the mechanical relationship between omnipotence and human free will. Plantinga introduces the free will defense, and it hinges on a crucial distinction between strong actualization and weak actualization.
Walk me through strong versus weak actualization.
Strong actualization is unilateral cause and effect. It's when God directly causes a state of affairs to obtain. God says, let there be light, and God strongly actualizes light. But if God desires to create a world containing creatures with significant free will, the mechanics change entirely. God cannot strongly actualize a free choice.
Because the moment you force a choice, it ceases to be free. It's like programming a robot to say, I love you. The robot says it perfectly every time, but it's not real love because the robot had no capacity to choose otherwise.
Precisely. By definition, if God causes you to do what is right, your action isn't free. So God can only weakly actualize a world with free creatures. He sets up the circumstances. He creates the free agents. He establishes the physics of the sandbox, but then he steps back. The creatures themselves determine which specific world becomes actual by the free choices they make.
God creates the sandbox, but the creatures build the castles or smash them.
Yes, and because God can only weakly actualize free choices, we arrive at the mind-bending concept Plantinga uses to shatter Mackey's logical contradiction. He calls it transworld depravity.
Transworld depravity. It sounds like a sci-fi dystopian novel. What exactly is it?
It is one of the most brilliant logical maneuvers in modern philosophy. Plantinga asks us to consider a hypothetical scenario regarding the essences of free creatures. Remember, an essence is the core identity of a person across all worlds. Plantinga proposes that it is logically possible that every single essence of a free creature is flawed in a very specific mathematical way.
Flawed out.
It is mathematically possible that no matter which possible world God instantiates a creature in, and no matter what perfect circumstances he places them in, if that creature is left significantly free, they will eventually freely choose to do at least one wrong action.
Wait. Let me try to map this out across the worlds. Let's trace my essence. In World A, I'm placed in a normal city, and I steal a candy bar. God sees this and says, let's try World B. I'll give him incredibly supportive parents and infinite wealth. So I'm born into World B. I don't steal the candy bar, but I lie on my taxes. God says, okay, let's try World C, a literal utopia with no scarcity. In World C, I don't lie, I don't steal, but I cut in line at the utopian water slide.
Yes.
Are you saying there might not be a single possible world in the entire infinite multiverse where I am both completely free and I never do anything wrong?
That is the strict definition of transworld depravity. Every single world where you are free, you ruin it at least once. Now, listen carefully. Plantinga is not saying this is definitively true of humanity. He is not making a theological claim that we are all actually completely depraved.
Then what is he doing?
He is establishing a logical possibility. If transworld depravity is even logically possible for all free creatures, it completely shatters Mackey's argument.
How does a mere possibility shatter Mackey?
Because Mackey claimed it was a strict logical contradiction for God and evil to exist. But if transworld depravity is possible, then there is a massive set of possible worlds, specifically the worlds with moral good, but absolutely no moral evil that God simply cannot actualize.
Oh, because the moment God tries to actualize that perfect world, the free creatures inside it ruin it by making their guaranteed bad choice. And if God steps in and forces them to be good to save the perfect world, they aren't free anymore, so the moral good of freedom disappears anyway. God is essentially boxed in by the math of his own creation's freedom.
Exactly. Therefore, an omnipotent God's power is limited by the very logic of the free will he grants his creatures. It is logically consistent for an omnipotent, holy, good God to exist and for moral evil to exist, because God could not actualize a world with moral good without also allowing the possibility of moral evil. The strict logical contradiction claimed by the atheist is completely broken.
Let's pause here and think about the implications. That is a massive philosophical checkmate. He essentially proved that omnipotence doesn't mean the ability to do the logically impossible, but I have to push back here, hard.
Please do.
The free will defense handles moral evil flawlessly. Humans hurt each other, that's the price of freedom. But what about natural evil? Earthquakes, tsunamis, childhood leukemia? A hurricane destroying an island isn't the result of human free will. Nobody chose to build a hurricane. So if God is omnipotent and good, why didn't he actualize a world with free will, but without tectonic plates that cause devastating earthquakes?
That is the natural next question. And Plantinga's answer here is going to sound shocking to modern ears. He follows a very traditional line of thought tracing back to St. Augustine. Plantinga posits that it is logically possible that natural evil is, in fact, the result of non-human free agents, specifically Satan and his fallen angels, or demons.
Whoa, okay, you're telling me one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century blamed earthquakes on demons? That is going to make our modern listeners immediately tune out. It sounds archaic.
Plantinga fully acknowledges that modern secular sensibilities will find the idea preposterous. But you have to remember his strict objective here. He is not writing a science textbook. He is not trying to physically prove how tectonic plates work. He is engaging in a strict logical defense against a claim of absolute contradiction.
Right. Mackey claimed it is logically impossible for God and evil to coexist.
Exactly. Plantinga doesn't have to scientifically prove that demons cause earthquakes. He only has to prove that it is logically possible that they do. Is it a logical contradiction to suggest that powerful non-human spirits with free will exist and affect the natural world? No, it's not a logical contradiction.
Okay, I see the maneuver. If it is even a mere logical possibility that natural disasters are the result of the free choices of non-human spirits, then natural evil is just a subcategory of moral evil. And we already proved that God can't forcefully stop moral evil without destroying free will.
Precisely. By opening up that logical possibility, the strict logical contradiction of natural evil is neutralized.
Okay, I concede the strict logic. It is not a 100% mathematical contradiction for God and suffering to exist. But let me pivot to the fallback position, the probabilistic argument. Because even if it's logically possible, look around. Look at the sheer overwhelming amount of evil, the millions of people suffering needlessly. Plantinga calculates evil in units he jokingly calls terps of evil. We have 10 to the 13th power terps of evil in this world. Even if God's existence isn't a strict logical contradiction, doesn't that vast, horrifying amount of evil make God's existence highly, highly improbable?
That is exactly where atheologians retreat when the logical contradiction fails. They say, fine, you beat the logic, but the probability is heavily against you. Plantinga addresses this head-on by examining what it actually means to calculate probability.
Okay, how do we calculate the probability of God based on evil?
You have to look at what Plantinga calls our total evidence. To prove that God's existence is mathematically improbable based on the amount of evil, you would have to definitively prove that God could have created a world with less evil without accidentally losing a greater moral good.
Right. You'd have to prove that removing one specific earthquake wouldn't somehow unravel a massive, invisible chain of events that eventually leads to an even greater good thousands of years later.
And Plantinga points out the devastating flaw in that calculation. Our total evidence as human beings is microscopically small. We are severely cognitively limited. We have absolutely no way of knowing the intricate multiverse-level calculations of what removing one single evil would do to the total cosmic balance of moral good.
It's the ultimate butterfly effect. If I erase a plague in the 14th century, maybe humanity never develops the resilience or the moral urgency to prevent a galaxy-ending war in the 30th century. I can't know.
Exactly. Because our cognitive limits are so severe and the web of causality is so vast, we cannot rationally claim that the current amount of evil makes God's existence mathematically or logically improbable. We simply do not have a large enough data set to run the numbers.
We are trying to read a book looking through a microscope.
Yes. So the problem of evil, both the strict logical version and the probabilistic version, is effectively neutralized by the possible world's architecture.
Which is an incredible feat of defense. But that brings us to Chapter 10, our final major topic today. Because if Plantinga can use possible worlds to defend God's existence, the natural question is, can he use them to actively prove it?
And that takes us into the ontological argument. This is an argument that has fascinated and frustrated philosophers since St. Anselm first proposed it in the 11th century.
Let's start with Anselm, because his version always felt like a trick to me.
Anselm argued that God is, by definition, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, the ultimate being. He reasoned that it is inherently greater to exist in actual reality than to exist merely as an idea in the mind. Therefore, if you can conceive of the greatest possible being in your mind, it must exist in reality, because if it didn't, it wouldn't be the greatest.
Yeah, that's the trick I'm talking about. It feels like linguistic sleight of hand. It's like me saying, I am imagining a perfect, flawless island. Part of being perfect is actually existing. Therefore, my perfect island must physically exist somewhere. Immanuel Kant famously crushed Anselm's argument by declaring that existence is not a predicate.
Kant argued that existence isn't a property you can add to a thing to make it greater. A concept of $100 doesn't gain a new property when you put $100 in your pocket. It's just instantiated. And interestingly, Plantinga agrees with Kant's instinct, though he uses his own multiverse architecture to expose Anselm's flaw more precisely.
How does Plantinga break down Anselm?
Plantinga points out that Anselm's original argument relied on comparing an existent object to a non-existent object and claiming the existent one is greater. But remember our discussion about fiction and Minong's ghost realm. Plantinga mathematically proved that non-existent objects don't exist and have zero properties. You cannot compare a real being with properties to a non-existent being with no properties. The comparison is logically incoherent.
Okay, so Anselm's 11th century version is dead, but Plantinga doesn't throw the argument away. He looks at the modal version, developed in the 20th century by philosophers like Charles Hartshorne and Norman Malcolm.
Yes. The modal version pivots away from Anselm's flawed comparison. Instead of arguing about mere existence, Malcolm shifted the focus to necessary existence. He argued that a maximally great being cannot exist contingently, If God existed contingently, it means God could theoretically go out of existence or might never have existed at all, which would instantly make him less than maximally great.
That tracks. A god that can be destroyed isn't much of a god, so if God exists at all, God must exist necessarily.
Right. But Plantinga takes Malcolm's framework and refines it into a weaponized, structurally perfect proof. He calls it his victorious modal version. He applies the exact tools of possible world we've been discussing for the last hour. Let's walk through the steps carefully.
I'm ready.
Step 1. We must clearly define maximal excellence. Plantinga says a being has maximal excellence in a specific world if it exhibits omniscience, omnipotence, and moral perfection in that specific world.
Okay. All-knowing, all-powerful, all good. That's a standard definition. Check.
Step 2. We define maximal greatness. A being has maximal greatness if and only if it possesses maximal excellence in every single possible world.
Okay, so a maximally great being isn't just perfect in World Alpha. It is perfect across the entire infinite multiverse grid. It never fails in any reality.
Now for step 3. This is the crucial premise upon which the entire argument rests. Plantinga asks you to grant one simple premise. It is possible that there is a maximally great being. In other words, out of the infinite expanse of possible worlds, this maximally great being exists in at least one of them.
Let me stop you right there. Is that a safe premise to grant? Just saying, it is possible.
It seems like an incredibly modest premise. You aren't admitting God exists. You are merely admitting that the concept of a maximally great being isn't a strict logical contradiction, like a square circle. You are just saying, sure, I can see there is at least one possible world somewhere in the multiverse where this being exists.
Okay, I don't see the trap. I'll grant the premise. It is logically possible.
Now for the conclusion. Step 4. You granted that a maximally great being exists in at least one possible world. But look back at step 2. What is the defining property of a maximally great being?
Its defining property is that it possesses maximal excellence in every possible world.
Exactly. So if it exists in one possible world, its very essence dictates that it has maximal excellence in all possible worlds. Therefore, it exists and is excellent in every single possible world. Therefore, it exists in the actual world.
Yeah.
Checkmate.
Wait, hold on. My brain is melting. Let me retrace that. You asked me to grant that it is merely possible for a maximally great being to exist in one single random alternate universe. But because the very definition of maximal greatness is existing in all universes, the exact moment I granted that it existed in one world, the definition forced it to spill over into every world, including this one.
That is exactly how the logic functions.
I need a metaphor for this. It's like a computer virus on a network of servers. The possible worlds are the servers. Maximal greatness is a specific type of code. If you introduce that code to even one server, the defining trait of the code is that it instantly and unstoppably replicates to all connected servers. Therefore, if it is even theoretically possible for the code to exist on one server, it necessarily already exists on ours.
That is a phenomenal metaphor. The property of maximal greatness is a world index property that necessitates its own universal instantiation. If it is possible, it is necessary. If it is necessary, it is actual.
Okay, but listen, if I'm an atheist listening to this, I'm feeling tricked. I granted a simple premise, and suddenly I proved God. Plantinga himself admits in the text that a hardened skeptic won't be converted by this argument. A skeptic will just look at the conclusion, panic, and back up to step 3. They will say, okay, I retract my permission. I refuse to grant that a maximally great being is even possible. The code doesn't exist on any server. If the skeptic can just deny the premise, what is the point of the victorious argument? Did Plantinga fail?
This is where we reach a profound realization about the true nature of philosophy. Plantinga explains that the goal of philosophical theology is rarely to build a trap that forces a screaming, kicking skeptic to surrender and convert.
And then what is the goal?
The goal is to prove that it is entirely rational, logically sound, and intellectually respectable for a person to hold this belief. Plantinga demonstrates that if a rational person accepts the incredibly modest premise that a maximally great being is possible, the logic flawlessly leads to the reality of God. He proves that theism isn't a logical fallacy. It is a structurally perfect logical system. He has removed what we call the intellectual veto.
The intellectual veto.
Yes. For decades, atheologians claimed that believing in God was inherently irrational, like believing in a square circle. Plantinga's victorious argument proves that belief in God is not only rational but logically rigorous. The skeptic can refuse the premise, but the skeptic can no longer claim the theist is being illogical.
That is a massive shift in perspective. It's not about forcing belief through a logical headlock. It's about validating the absolute rationality of belief.
Exactly. And that is the ultimate triumph of the nature of necessity.
Which is the perfect place for us to pull all of this together into our comprehensive summary and takeaway. We have covered an astonishing amount of metaphysical ground today.
We truly have. We started in the weeds, rescuing the very concept of necessity from 20th century linguistic reductionism. We proved that necessity isn't just human grammar, and we established that objects possess essential properties in and of themselves.
From there, we mapped out the vast multiverse of possible worlds. We learned about maximal states of affairs, the books that describe them, and the unique property of actuality that pins our world, alpha, to reality. We discovered how world-indexed properties work, anchoring our contingent actions to our essential identities.
We then solved the paradox of transworld identity, rejecting the depressing fatalism of counterpart theory and proving that your unique essence travels across the worlds. And we banished the ancient ghosts of Meinong, proving that non-existent objects have no properties and that fiction is simply the exhibition of uninstantiated storylines.
And finally, we took that massive, pristine architecture and used it to solve the centuries-old problem of evil. Using the free will defense and the concept of transworld depravity, we proved that God and evil are logically compatible. And we ended by using the multiverse to construct the victorious ontological argument, showing that if God is even possible, God is necessary.
Alvin Plantinga took the cold, mathematical weapons of modern modal logic and used them to defend classical metaphysics and theology. He built a rigorous, unassailable logical architecture that fundamentally redefined 20th century philosophy. It is a monumental intellectual achievement.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We've explored the absolute limits of necessity, possibility, and reality today. But before we go, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to chew
I
on.
love these.
Think back to the reality of trans-world identity. Your unique essence, the irreducible core of who you are, travels across infinite possible worlds. In every world, it dictates your essential properties, while your accidental properties, your job, your clothes, the choices you made yesterday shift and change endlessly. If that is true, what if your essence contains a profound capacity, a unique monumental potential that you simply haven't discovered yet in this actual world? What if the greatest version of yourself isn't a fantasy, but is fully realized right now, mathematically speaking, in a world just adjacent to ours, just waiting for you to actualize it here? Keep exploring. See you next time.